Oh, perfect. So I think we can go live. And then let me make sure that if you go like that. Oh, I can. There we go. Cool. Hold on, I'm going to say, can you hear us, those on YouTube?
So how do I advance slides?
When you're over here, just click here and you can just go like this.
Okay, perfect.
And you can see up there.
Okay, okay, wonderful.
Yeah. Now there's a little bit of delay too, so
I
it
might have
be.
to put it up here.
Oh, that's fine.
Maybe. I did.
That's fine. We should have enough. Oh yeah. Okay, yeah. Stephanie Ramos says that they can hear us.
This doesn't work.
I know, it's so stupid.
But that's fine. I can just advance in that.
Yeah.
And there's a mouse in case like I need. Well, whatever. I'm not gonna need it.
Cool. They can hear us, so we are live. Hey, it worked. They didn't totally fail at this. Yeah, I think it's up there.
Ready?
Yeah, I can. Do you want me to do the introduction, or do you want
I
to?
introduce you.
Okay.
I can introduce the lecture series. Stephanie gets to introduce the speaker. Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first lecture in our fall lecture series. It's great to have you here. We're off to a great start in any number of ways, and this is just a part of it. I got an email today from somebody in the senior administration who just happened to walk through Hutchinson yesterday and couldn't believe all the work on the walls. It's just great. So he's got all these projects now that he wants us to get involved with, helping out on the campus, and that's just one of the things that we do. We have such a presence here, and such appreciation for the School of Architecture and the design programs, and that is for all of you. So keep it up. Keep working hard. Keep doing great stuff. It should be a great year. We've got students in Rome. I teach a course both here and in China. I used to be teaching at 6 in the morning, and my time in China was 6 in the evening for them. And we finally said, wait a minute, why don't we just do this all together? So now we're going to have students in China, students in Rome, students in Spain, students who don't have to come to campus who want to go at home. All in that same course. This is sort of the new world we're heading in. But it should be a great opportunity to kind of promote more engagement between what's going on here and what's going on in our school there. If you haven't really plugged into what's happening here, you should. Our building got finished. It's gotten a lot of attention, published. Pretty great. You all had the chance to go there as soon as the quarantine ends, which I'm told will be next month. And you should really think about it. Such an amazing opportunity to take the same courses that you take here, but do it in China, and the university pays for your budget. So all some things that you think about. It's weird not to turn this over to Craig because Craig does everything here. But now that Stephanie's here, Stephanie sort of does everything else here. And so Craig will always organize the lecture series and organize Rome single-handedly and all this great stuff. Now he has somebody else to work with him on this. And Stephanie is an amazing addition to our faculty, and she has been everywhere. Did a building project up in Bethel Woods over the weekend, which everybody should plug into. And again, it's just one indication of all the good stuff that's going on. So enjoy the ride, stay in touch, and
Great. All right. Today I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the fall lecture series, Viola Ago. Viola is an Albanian. Ooh, microphone's kind of sassy. All right, stay there. All right. Viola is an Albanian architectural designer and researcher currently based in New York. She directs Miracles Architecture and is currently a visiting assistant professor at Pratt Most recently, Viola was a Wortham Fellow at Rice University, the Yesios Visiting Professor at Ohio State, and the William Muschenheim Design Fellow at the University of Michigan. She has taught at Harvard University Graduate School of Design, Rhode Island School of Design, and SciArc, and UCLA most recently. She earned her Master's of Architecture from SciArc and her BArch from Yersin University in Toronto. And prior to teaching, Viola worked as a lead designer in the advanced technology team at Morphosis Architects in Los Angeles. Viola's work has been exhibited in many places, such as Los Angeles, Ghent, San Francisco, Columbus, and Ann Arbor, and Cincinnati. And her work has been published, her written work has been published in Log, Wiley's AD, Architectural Design Magazine, Religious Instabilities and Potentialities book, SciArc's Off-Ramp, Acadia, the TA Emerging Design and Technology Journal, JE, Architects Newspaper, basically everywhere. Viola has held digital fabrication residencies at Autodesk BuildSpace in Boston, a University in Design and Research Fellowship at Exhibit Columbus, and an artist residency at McDowell. And to me, the reason why I think Viola would be a great start to this lecture series is that Viola's work strikes a complex balance. One between simulations, aesthetics, and its related tensions between surface, volume, and politics. Its complexity is heightened and articulated through parts and components that connect, come together, and fall apart, exacerbating, in a good way, the tensions between surface and volume. And with that note, I would like to welcome Viola.
Second for me to set up. And everyone can hear me in the back as well? Awesome, wonderful, thank you. Okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming. I am elated to open your lecture series and to visit your campus for the first time. I also want to begin, of course, with some gratitude by thanking Stephanie for the invitation to the school and to ask me to share some of my work with you all. I'm also, again, happy to get an opportunity to visit your program and see what you guys are up to. So I also like the work that is up on the walls, or the glazing rather. Okay, so today I'll be talking about something that I started referring to as compositional physics and architecture. With this project, today I particularly want to focus on politics and how these politics lead to simulation methodologies, and lastly, how all of that ties into some sort of aesthetic regime. So, this is me trying to advance the slides.
I think it's a down arrow.
The down arrow. I don't see the mouse.
Oh, the mouse is up there. That's why. Wait, can I see it on the screen? So, you click on it. There you go.
There we go. So then, down arrow?
Yeah.
Okay. I've built this lecture on these three main parts. So we're going to start with a question of political thought and how the method, and then how the method of phenomenology of empathy and lyricism, as opposed to narrative, which might be a contentious theme, but how these things can guide us as creative workers towards design proposals in architecture that are impactful. And I want to know that it is impact that I'm after, not necessarily solutions, not necessarily progress, and not this sort of like good or bad impact either, because I truly believe that the moment that we give in to the kind of Western-centric evaluative criteria, which is based on this like singular kind of opposing qualities such as good versus bad, we're also giving in to a kind of authoritative ideology. So I hope that with this lecture, I can show how my work attempts to sit comfortably in the now, in the present, with things that already exist in our destabilized world, I might add, and how to occupy a pluralistic landscape, which can be quite liberating. So I want to start playing this video installation artwork by Theaster Gates. This piece is titled "Gone Are the Days of Shelter and Martyr" and was part of a seminal group exhibition at the New Museum in New York City, titled Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America. This exhibition was based on the curatorial work of Ugwe and Wizard. So this video shows a recording of a performance that was part scripted and part improvised on site, where an intimate and intense group of musicians occupied the abandoned and dilapidated St. Louis Church in South Shore, Chicago. According to Gates, the church has been an important venue for the local community, and its demolition was absolutely devastating to that community. So in the performance, the musicians used their bodies to physically move imminent and inanimate artifacts in the church and their resultant sounds to ephemerally activate the complex history of the church. There is force and there's violence in the scene, multi-layered and multifaceted. In my opinion, this installation offers a fascinating example of work that zeroes in on the relationship between politics and architecture. It is even more relevant for our current moment because our material and immaterial states of duress are ever so present. So with this in mind, I would argue that it's impossible to imagine architectural space where the politics of destruction are not considered. So I want to turn for a moment to Frantz Fanon's theories of violence and aggression. Fanon was a psychiatrist and a political philosopher who was quite influential in the fields of critical theory and post-colonial studies. In his 1961 book, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon sketches an immersive parallel between the colonizer and the colonized in his chapter on violence. He describes the colonizer's imposed value system as violence and the response of the colonized as aggression. This weighs quite heavy now in 2022, 60 years after the book's publication, and to me it rings just as true now, which is quite a bizarre notion. So, odd as it may be, I also want to bring in Bruno Latour into this conversation. I do want to talk about this imminent versus transcendental axes. So imminent is what is already here in our world, in our room, present with us, and transcendental as something that is immaterial that results from some sort of experience. Latour's composition theory aligns with a critique of the modernist notion of progress and with it, part-to-whole logics. So, as I just mentioned, Latour's theory is primarily concerned with the imminent condition of what is already in the world. So, kind of avoiding the new novelty, so to speak. So, in other words, the theory composes existing things, so things that we already know, in non-hierarchical and non-totalizing organizations, as opposed to the modernist transcendental model that I just described a minute ago. So, to illustrate, he uses Thomas Sarasano's work on the right, here, as a visual metaphor that resists hierarchical order and center points. So instead, creates highly intricate conditions of nesting and interdependence onto what hopes to be a flat ontological scheme. So what I question, however, and I invite you to think about this as well with me, are Latour and Sarasano failing to escape the stronghold of abstraction with this work? And let's be real, abstraction is a truly modernist notion. And by extension, I think it's also an exclusionary condition. But then also it's important to remember that long-lasting change does take time. So maybe this was just a step in the right direction. So in looking past the binary model towards, so good versus bad, towards methods that are enmeshed and are fluid, I want to lastly turn for another quick moment to two primary ideas postulated by anthropologist Tim Ingold. So in brief, Ingold argues for the method of continuum that he refers to as a kind of enmeshing or a type of correspondence. So instead of reinforcing the typical delamination of the event, so some event takes place and perception and we perceive said event, whether it's visual, artistic, or architectural or whatever, he proposes that the event and the perception of that event occur simultaneously because the two are in correspondence with one another. So he says that the creative and the perceptive event occur alongside one another. So the way that I like to think about this in relationship to violence and aggression is that these two things are actually happening simultaneously, though we may not see them because oftentimes these occurrences are immaterial. And I'll get to that in just a minute. So in the question of the material and immaterial, I want to turn again to forensic architecture's Isle Weitzman. In introducing his book, Forensic Architecture, Violence at the Threshold of Detectability, Weitzman begins by describing this imperative role that architecture played in legal courts during the trials of David Irving, who was one of the most notorious and dangerous Holocaust deniers of our time. So Weitzman convincingly, in my opinion, argues that buildings register and remember atrocities committed during violent moments in history, which is especially helpful when forensic matter does not survive the crime scene for whatever reason. So in these cases, it's the material architectural remains that act as witnesses to retell stories that are so often denied by nationalists or religious extremists or nefarious governmental bodies or individuals, paramilitary group, you name it. So these denials happen in tandem with other highly dangerous conditions, unfortunately. They're not standalone, they're not isolated. So for example, and I won't get into this too much today, but in the Balkans conflict, where a lot of my research is focused, this region is particularly interesting because of its extreme geopolitical current condition and its history, which is also tied to the current war in Ukraine and the ultimate war of West versus East. So in this region, investigative journalism, UN commissions point to foreign interventions, primarily Russian and Chinese, giving rise to already existing ethnic tensions that could lead to another possible war. In the most recent example, a neo-nationalist member of the already unstable tripartite presidency in Bosnia unfathomably, in my opinion, denied the Srebrenica massacre of 1995, which is considered the worst European genocide since World War II. So though not directly tied to the Balkan conflicts in so many ways and wars over the years, here's another recent tension-rising area, which is in Armenia, another highly complex geopolitical problem, intricately tied to religion and ethnicity. So here we see again a struggle for overcoming the denier paradox in the midst of political and ethnic tensions. So to return to Weitzman's proposal from earlier, luckily, somewhat, in our present day, we do have media and technology that can detect, can register, and record violent acts, and therefore denials have become just a bit more difficult from the material standpoint as opposed to 60 years ago. However, I'm also thinking that a different kind of denial has started to emerge, oftentimes government-sanctioned, corporation-backed, through the use of, unfortunately, architecture, as is the case here. So here we see a most recent proposal by MVRDV, a firm that I deeply respected and honored in the late aughts when I was just transitioning from undergrad to grad. This proposal is titled The Gagarin Valley. So here's a quote from one of the founding partners, Vinny Mas. The area is named after Yuri Gagarin, who was the first human to orbit the Earth. He saw the planet's vulnerability, a house in need of extra care, as many other astronauts have since stressed. I share that concern. Stimulating biodiversity, improving water management, and the ecosystem is of great importance for the future of the Gagarin Valley and the world. The valley can be seen as a series of test fields for the 10,000 species that will soon flourish there, and enrichment that will give the area the appearance of a Garden of Eden. Okay. So I think we can take probably another entire hour to just unpack this one statement alone. Can't do that tonight. But I do want to stress the complex of the Western savior coming in to a destabilized nation to act the hero, and on top of it all, to refer to the development in biblical terms. Keeping in mind here that religion is one of the primary leading causes of the conflict and subsequent genocide in the region. So here's another most recent example. It's a proposal in the most typical Western corporate aesthetic of smooth glass, steel panels for a performing arts center designed by Bjarke Engel's group's architects. This theater proposal is to be built on a site where the old historical theater set, which was illegally demolished in the capital city of Albania. So therefore, this new proposal, shaped as a bow tie, which is a fashion article associated with male masculinity, erases and denies any and all historical layers that existed in the original fabric of the old theater. This sort of invisible and stealthy form of denial has started to take place in parts of the world that are still in the way picking up the pieces from extreme violent events in their recent pasts, from war, colonization, genocide, and so on. Oftentimes, these places are also in regions that are in the developing world, if I wanted to throw another term to contend with today. So it seems to me that the Western corporate aesthetic has been sold to the non-West as a kind of one-way ticket towards modernization and with it, so-called progress. This approach has not only failed to contribute to that promised progress, but in addition, it's also tragically erased a history of a place by building an architecture which has limited to non-existent relationships with its context. So this is a type of cleansing mechanism that denies the history of a place in favor of an aesthetic production that is maliciously offered as progressive, new, novel, transcendental. All right, so the deployment of this type of architectural practice has historically led to the surge of unregulated neoliberal urbanization schemes that further encourage division and hostility over reconciliation. Here's another example in Belgrade, capital of Serbia, also in the Balkans, which is another extremely contested and complicated site. I also want to point to the denial of a place, its people, and its history in the guise of a progressive Western aesthetic. It's always brought to these lands by foreign intervention and investment. And I'm going to say investment with air quotes on there. Okay. So what can we do with all of this? And how is this relevant to creative agents in architecture? And even more of an impossible question is how or why should we care? So to get to that, I'd like to read just this one excerpt from Jarius Grove from his recent book titled Savage Ecologies, War and Geopolitics at the End of the World. Quite the title. In his chapter on violence, which he refers to violence as a form of life, Grove writes, "To put it more bluntly, politics, colonialism, settlement, capitalism, ecological destruction, racism, and misogynies are not war by other means, they are war. War is not a metaphor, it is an intensive fabric of relations making the Eurocene." And just a side note, Grove uses the term the Eurocene as an analogy to the Anthropocene, but in this case he's referring to the epoch as a Eurocentric capitalist regime that does not necessarily have to do with the geological or the anthropomorphic. So in all, Grove argues that war is central to being, war is everywhere, and as such he refers to war in the present day as a form of life, as a way of being in the world even. So my takeaway from that is that where we are, by definition, we are also agents of war. Being in the United States, for example, and being members in any way in the system, which is violent in its structure, we cannot escape that system. So again, this is what Grove calls a form of life, and with that in mind, this all means that by definition, we are weaponized entities and in turn implicated in the violence aggression axes that I was speaking about earlier. So I want to take just a quick break from the framework and present a speculative project that is still in progress and will be for a long time, but it attempts to propose an alternative aesthetic position and formal apparatus that I hope can start to respond to this violent form of life that we occupy, consciously or not. So in my own work, I argue that elements in a composition that register transformations from a physical impact can embody the creative force behind this conflict-centric form of life. So here we see an animation sequence of panels that seem to tremble from a hosting frame underneath. In this diagram, it is in red. You can kind of see it. This is a panel-based composition simulation proposed as a pavilion. So in this case, we see a roof-like structure that seems to have missed its host entirely and is sort of resting on the ground. It is blanketed in a graphic that is pictorially similar to its surrounding, to the natural environment, but also digitally altered with unrealistic and maybe undesirable red hues in an attempt to extend our visual imaginary. In addition, While the main structure seems that it is clad and coherently aligned and perfectly adjointed transparent panels, the panels are in fact mismatched and shifted in order to highlight a disjointedness, a turbulence that was again simulated using digital physics engines. So here you can see that on diagram B4 on the bottom right. You can see that red a little bit more. So here we see the animation of one of the digital simulations that is using turbulence as a force that destabilizes. Let me click on that. Okay. Did it play? It did play? Okay. It destabilizes frames from a predetermined, sort of like perfect position. So I want to start pointing to the question of process here, and that it is in this experiential space that I hope to engage with the disruptive and other qualities that have been typically referred to as undesirable or negative and treated as hindering rather than benefiting. So here we see a rendered view of the pavilion proposal, and again, this is to be thought of as one possible instantiation, like one possible permutation that was derived from the digital simulation and not necessarily as a final form. So another theme that I will discuss consistently in this talk is also process proper, another contestant term in architecture. Again, so that this version seen here is it's an extracted frame from the animation sequence, in other words, the process, and therefore this proposal exists in the same space as the process that generated it. So in other words, you cannot think of this render without the animate, forceful event that created it. And here I also want to highlight that sort of the graphic application, which is consistent in my work. It's another consistent aspect that operates in a similar way as the material parts. In this case, the material parts would be the panels. So the graphic, it kind of carries this digital residue of graphic conditions that have been developed through similar digital tools of forces acting on a dematerialized layer that has sort of like haphazardly wrapped onto a cluster of panels. So there is no precision in this work, intentionally so. All right, so these inquiries are not new to architecture at all. The deconstructivists worked with similar methods of inquiry. Here we see Eisenman's Max Reinhardt house. Not that we need to see this, we've seen it for many, many years. But I wanted to bring this in because this was, for example, this was developed as an event, right? So we see in the diagram that a rectangular shape is tracing a Mobius strip in 3D space. So the process in this example too is very much also the final product, the final form. So the deconstructivists were working through projects that similarly defined the laws of physics. They confronted wholeness with finite libraries of elements. They challenged geometric truths and kind of resisted the conventional typologies and assemblies that were left over from modernism. Another example by Daniel Libeskind. So deconstructivism, unfortunately, also inevitably became a style, even though its creators claimed that they were interested in ideas, and as such argued that its placement in the canon as a style was in a way antithetical to the original ambitions. This too, also not a new phenomenon in architecture. It's very common that new architectural ideas do not necessarily seek to establish a new style, but they do lead to movements. Movements gain momentum, and momentums lay the groundwork for the establishment of style. So one of the aspects that I think distinguishes the decons from some of the work that we see now is that those projects, they could not escape the evaluative problem, the one that establishes the kind of overall watchdog ideology. So taking cues from visual dynamics and even Gestalt theory, the decons were ultimately working towards architectural effects that were rooted in the visual experience alone. So one thinks of Theodor Lipps, Rudolf Arnheim, and their perceptual mimetic psychology theories and visual dynamics to qualify the work. Again, here we talk about the finalized work, work in its true state. So for example, in this example here in the photograph, Arnheim argues that when a viewing subject is confronted with an anthropomorphic phenomenon, that we ultimately read the rest of the scene from that standpoint. So in the example on the right, we are defaulted to associate the diagonal handrail to the diagonal posture of the sleeping person in front of an otherwise quite orthogonally organized building facade. Okay, so the setup is simply inadequate for our current moment, simply put, in my opinion anyway. So my hyper-focus turn to process is in the space of correspondence, as I described through Tim Ingold. It's an attempt to avoid stylistic concerns and other vetted schemes or projects in favor of more aleatory sort of sways and these kinds of non-deterministic positions in architecture and other creative disciplines too, not just ours. So turning to Edith Fein's Phenomenology of Empathy, I borrow her term fusion to describe a type of axes. So I call this the fusion axes in the red over there. I hope you can see it. This is what I start to refer to as a kind of miraculous moment, as a fantastical moment, when the sensorial body and the physical body of an individual fuse in this abstract space while they experience a foreign thing in the world. So, more specifically, this fusion axis, it kind of characterizes the moment when an individual's perception that sort of forms the empathy communicates between the sensorial, so the thing that we do not see, so our sensorial apparatus, and our physical bodies, and subsequently the individual makes the decision to interact with this process. So in a physics engine simulation, as we saw just a few slides ago, that means that it is in this space of an empathetic experience that an author is inclined to click and alter the input parameters of a destabilized roof, or add turbulence to panels of a sculpture or pavilion, or melt a digital graphic layer, as we saw in some of the renderings of this proposal. So with the framework in mind of embracing an imminent condition of violence, turning to process, and resting in a space of correspondence or sensorial and physiognomic axes, I want to turn to some of my design and research work. So I'll start with Poppy Red. I'm just going to show a few. And this is truly a design research project. And I hope that becomes clear what I mean by design research project. It's ongoing. It informs a lot of my projects in various ways. It doesn't have an end or a beginning, just some work and some process in between. So Poppy Red is a project that began it started as a writing project. It was trying to test the capacities of massing strategies that result from forces of compression and graphic conditions that can alter the legibility of an underlying form. So this project travels like non-linearly through many different digital platform packages and so on. But in theory, it takes its cues from physical artifacts. So these physical studies show a series of attempts to wrap the 3D form that we saw with a 2D drawing from the previous slide. In much of my work, you'll notice this interest in studying raster conditions of vector-based data. So Photoshop conditions of Illustrator or Rhino 2D line work. So the object of destruction, so to speak, in this project, it's neither the graphic nor the form, but rather what I like to think about is the event. So the event that drives one against the other, that collapses these 3D forms against 2D graphic planes. Okay, so here's that selection again. So we have some of the methodologies. We have hydro-dipping, flatbed printing, vinyl mapping, back painting, vacuum forming on rigid materials, and so on. So this matrix tests this forceful encounter between the 2D graphic surface and the 3D form, and I'm hoping that it offers qualities that can advance our exploration in the confrontation of painterly effects and architectural volumes. So in looking for deviations from order and these kinds of slippages between 2D and 3D information, I became most interested in the hydro-dipping technique, since it's actually like literal fluidity, the water, challenged the faceted nature of the geometric support. So I turned to digital simulations tools to co-opt the behavior of water transfer printing from the physical studies that we saw earlier. And a critical point to take note of is that the goal is not to precisely imitate natural behavior. That was part of the early 2010s, I think, the digital exuberance group. But to turn to an architectural proposal from earlier, the ambition here is to capitalize on an event that is equal parts fake and real, and processes guided by a phenomenology of empathy. So these simulations selectively replicate water transfer behaviors through varying individual parameters. So here's two material process studies side by side. Again, in the process, I'm interested in testing the limits and boundaries of these operations, and constantly depending on my kind of like empathetic reaction to this forceful encounter between form and graphic. So here's the case using these image sequence as well. So I then select one of the frames, just like the pavilion proposal, from the animation sequence, panelize it, and look at the graphic results from the transfer event. So now we start to understand that the graphic geosystem, we can start to see it through more conventional methods of panelized systems that assemble together to create some form. All right, and here's some detailed views of one of the large-scale models of Poppy Red, one where the graphic intentionally starts to miss its geometric edge in favor of altered flatbed picture planes, so that the viewer can observe it differently from different positions in space. And it's also important to note that the physical model, again, is just one possible instantiation, one possible option, one possible permutation from the entirety of the process. So likewise, other frames from the animation sequence could have been selected for further development. So here we see, again, like misalignments and sort of like misbehaving lines that are resultant from that kind of stretching and wrapping mechanism of the graphic once the volume is pushed through it. And I did exhibit this work at the Pink Comma Gallery in Boston in 2019, so back when we used to have exhibitions in person. So for this instantiation, I staged a series of animations and simulations, again, that celebrated the variations of the graphic quality. And again, like I wanted to show a sort of a kind of survey of the process, or like the different steps in the process, because I think that that's not only important, but also I like to think that my audience is primarily students. So, and Poppy Red is, again, like one of those projects that continues to inform my work in this way. So another way to put it is that these projects are actually quite intertwined with one another, and it almost feels like a little silly to delaminate them as project 1, 2, or 3. But anyway, so here I'm taking the same 2D drawing information from Poppy Red, altering the colors and pushing this print fakely into the digital event even further. So here we have a matrix of some extracted frames from the animation sequence for the simulation. Again, we're looking at loose imitation of the forces at play rather than that kind of like precision. So again, like we're not interested in the technological novelty and replicating something from the digital to the physical with high fidelity. This is the top view, which is really important because, again, I'm definitely interested in restricting my process to occupy mainly one Cartesian direction. So again, I keep most of my design experimental processes in the z-axes. So these extracted frames are helpful in seeing the progression of the simulation and the forces that generate alternate aesthetic experiences. And here we have the top view of what I'm calling a house 1 from a 3-house series. So my hope is that the matrix in the previous slide is not merely a diagram, but the matrix is a kind of method for generating and also perceiving the work. So this is because one sees the matrix when one sees the matrix, they see the event that capitalizes on the creative power of the digital physics simulation. And here we're zooming in even further on the image to look at some of those fine lines and some of those details in the process. And most importantly, looking at an elevation as a result. So I say most importantly because although I'm dedicated to the z-axis in the process, the elevation is actually the moment where the vulnerability of the designer and the process is exposed. And this is a good thing. So the elevation starts to behave on its own in a way. And because of the restrictive process, that z-axis, I have no choice but to accept this elevation with all of its fissures and misalignments and other kind of like distraught characteristics. In a closer view here, we can actually start to notice more overtly how the red lines are no longer lines, but they become like linear color fields. And then the white lines, though not exactly tectonic in this example, are also at moments taking on that same rasterized language. So they still exist in a weird, undefined zone. And with that, here's another instantiation. This is what I'm referring to as house 2, generic, as an elevation zoomed in so that, again, we can see some of the vector raster blurs that are starting to occur. So again, the kind of the photoshopping of the illustrator of the rhino. In House 2, there's also a logic of the interior organization, the response to some of the material definitions of the exterior shell layer. So similarly to House 1 and to Poppy Red, House 2 also begins with a 2D drawing and a 3D volumetric cluster. The graphic stretches in House 2, though it may not be as extreme as in House 1. It does involve additional production processes and material definitions that are much more fragmented. So the architectural articulation of the design process becomes much more complex in this project. So in the production animation sequence, we can see how these two primary drivers of the work start to converge. And I think that it's also interesting here to see the slippages between intentionality and chance. So intention in the Z and chance in the elevation. So there's aspects of the work that, again, are intentional and are very present in the process, but in that process, there's also aspects that simply arise and could not have been accounted for. So it's an important aspect to capitalize on. It's, again, a type of vulnerability to the work. And here we see the kind of construct focusing on the fragmentation aspect of the material articulations. I'd like to believe that this fragmentation further celebrates the collapse of the 2D and of the 3D in terms of like localizing global conditions and the material choices, and they're in a way like predetermined from the original 2D drawing. And then in section, I try to carry through the kind of like nesting form idea. So organizationally, the interior program too has been kind of sprinkled through the space in response to the transparencies afforded by the cladding system and the graphic boundaries. As a continuation, and also I would say sometimes deviation from the research, I'm going to quickly show just two projects to kind of wrap up. They're both collaborative projects with my co-fellow Hans Tersak. So this project, titled Transfers, is located in a sculpture park. It's called Art OMI, and it's in Ghent, New York. It's in upstate New York. I think about a couple hours from here, I think. It's been up since 2018, and it's surprisingly looks still the same as when it was installed. And that's due to the production methodologies. So in this animation sequence, we're seeing the kind of the entire orchestration of parts that are needed down to the connection details in order to construct this piece. So again, it's important to note that the use of animation sequence as a tool to think through the fabrication and production process, it's also like worthy to note that there's a separation between the graphic layer and the geometric entity. So again, here the basic premise of the project is that the piece should kind of read like a proto-architectural massing study. In our conversations with the curator, because this was a commission piece, we decided that it should read like a forced geometric cluster that's been situated in the woods. So kind of thinking about that natural and like forceful geometries in an otherwise natural system. So outlining the graphic, these are some of the primary sources of inspiration for the project because it is kind of rooted in geometric acrobatics, let's say. So here we see some of those volumetric clusters projected, dragged through a 2.5D environment, which is also a really important moment for that sort of like Z direction that I was talking about. So from a formal perspective, the aim of the project was to kind of reconcile a crystalline, faceted geometric massing study with like line work, 2D drawing, small fills, and so on. As in the installation, the hope is that you can sort of read the influence of like mass and line, like we saw a little bit earlier. And this is a form generation diagram. So on the second row of the drawing, you can start to see a kind of like carving operation on the outer volume to try to reveal some type of inner figure, or kind of like emerging figure. And on the third row, a sequence of compressive forces that begin to kind of like crush on the volume in and on itself. So we've been looking at solid masses so far. When it actually comes to building this, it's made out of very thin panels. So this project is actually made out of solid surface material. It's half plastic, half stone, and it's 1/4 inch thick, and which also sits in another 1/4 inch thick aluminum structure. So following some of the work from earlier, so again, like here we're thinking of like the panels, or that kind of the panel methodology is something that is kind of continuous in some of these like sculptural works. So the panels here are flatbed printed, not unlike some of the work in Poppy Red. They're flatbed printed using a commercial sign printer, so it's a UV cured ink, and it's printed directly onto the rigid surfaces, the rigid panels. And again, like there's another dimension to this. This was like flat packed, and there's a kind of justification for this because we had to construct the piece on site. And here it is again under construction. I think the tolerance level to this one was 1/32 of an inch in the fabrication. Bad idea, it should have been a 16th. But anyway, so the assembly logics also here take into consideration that we're going to construct the piece with very low tech, like out in the middle of the woods in a sculpture park. So I think that also enters the part of the conversation. And here we also thought it was actually important to express that kind of the hardware, the connection system, rather than typically what we tend to do in architecture is to hide everything away, patch it, make everything super seamless. And it could be like a residue from like the digital technologies or digital renderings from maybe 10, 15 years earlier. Anyway, so it should read like a kind of continuous shell from far away again, and like a kind of assembly up close. I think like one of the better views, I think this is like the back view, and it's actually kind of my favorite, because here you can actually see how the graphic starts to skip and is sort of it does its own thing. It doesn't really follow the logics of the massing. So there's a kind of delamination, a kind of confrontation between the graphic and the form. Which again, like, is another theme in my work, and this question of like the graphic map and how it talks to its three-dimensional support, or in other words, you can think of it as a frame. So the conversation between drawing material and material assembly is what hopefully like motivates somebody to walk through and experience this thing in the round. And here's the last photo of the installation in the snow, which I think is really interesting because the white of the sculpture kind of disappears into the snow, which we didn't originally anticipate. So there's a kind of resultant condition in there as well. All right, so last project, the second collaborative project. This was installed and exhibited in Columbus, Indiana. It was part of the biannual exhibition efforts of Exhibit Columbus, and it sits in front of Eero Saarinen's First Christian Church. So here we see again a form generation diagram, not unlike the previous ones that we've seen, but here there's a different kind of sequence. It's a little bit more procedural and explanatory as it relates more to the construction process. So the basic material idea for this pavilion is that, again, like it co-opts ready-made assembly logics from kit of parts. But it's also a combination of off-the-shelf components and machine precision fabricated parts. So you can see all the parts here in the two elevations and the roof being extracted from the original position in this exploded diagram. And then you can also see the kind of like the 5 parts assembly here a little bit more clearly. So starting from the left, you see the earth anchors and the custom connections from panel to panel, the bent tubes in the same in that second diagram, the straight cut tubes in the third diagram, with lastly the subdivided panels on the very right. So the pavilion was based on 2 relatively simple decisions, I would say, that made the fabrication and construction phase possible. So the first one was the decision to unify all the unique radii from an infinite amount, as seen on the diagram on the left. So that was the original design. So we unified it to 1 radius value, as seen on the diagram on the right. So in this way, we only needed 1 die in the CNC tube bending process. So the second decision, or rather discovery, I would say, in the process, was to offload all the custom angles to 2D planar cutting fabrication. So it's a much lighter endeavor from a machining perspective. So all the connections seen here are made from aluminum, from water jet aluminum plates. So this pavilion has no 90 degrees whatsoever in it, but this was perhaps the most critical step in the planning and the testing phase. So the 2 flat blades that you're seeing that connect the 2 tubes from panel to panel on the image, they're produced by simple planar cutting, so there's no 3D or multi-axis fabrication in here. So it completely offloads the kind of like the unique connections onto just a 2D cutting, which is ultimately much easier than anything that's 3D. So here we're on site in the pavilion. It was I think about 2 weeks and 4 of us on site on and off working to assemble the piece. So from a formal perspective, the pavilion asks whether or not an architectural structure or a wireframe can be expressive. And again, there's also this idea of form as a diagram of forces. So in the elevation view, the resultant view, we are confronted with fragmented panels, which has been composed in an almost vertical plane. And here's the view from the interior. So the question of enclosure was another important issue in this iteration as we started to consider the ground plane as a site of casual encounter between human and non-human subjects. So the scale of the pavilion is actually determined by its proximity to the understory of the trees on the site, and not by the occupants, such as the human scale, as one might expect. So here's just another few views on that interior. And the connection parts here that again negotiate all the different angles, because there's no 90 degree angles in here, on all the different directions of the structure and panels simultaneously. And here's another overall view, so you can see the pavilion that truly sits on that understory of the existing context. So I presented the extent of like the digital fabrication and research work in relation to the scale of this project, but the ambition really is to pose this pavilion as a model for something that can be scalable, depending again on a different site, a different program, and other kinds of requirements. But in any case, the ambition of the project is to display the kind of relationships between multiple elements, such as planar arrangements, wireframe and linear expressions, formal articulations, surface conditions, and it attempts to propose this as a kind of viable architectural solution. And I'm going to end this visual lecture with this video of the pavilion and some kind of concluding notes, because I want to return just one final time and try to expand on this question of perceptual mechanisms, and I want to do that by ways of a philosopher, Jane Bennett, somebody who I've been reading for a while and who I think brings up some really important questions. So Bennett, a political theorist and philosopher actually, she describes this concept that she refers to as lyrical force. So to return to the very beginning, lyrical force that is in opposition to narrative. And narrative has a very long history in architecture. So Bennett tells us that when a viewing subject, so whether I'm an architect or creative worker or whatever, when me, for example, or any viewing subject encounters a thing that has lyrical force, so not everything has lyrical force, or maybe some things have it in relationship to the encounter, they can be overcome with this extraordinary fascination with the thing that they encounter or with the encounter itself. So we're agents that we see and then we create, but in creating we're also encountering the thing that we are creating. So she further adds that our human perception, actually through its history, it's structured naturally to look for these extraordinary moments. So we naturally want to look out for these extraordinary moments. And even though we've been recently, in the kind of like modernist period, we've been trained to look for structured conditions. So almost circling back here to the violence of the imposed order and structure that we're forced into. So Bennett is hoping that we can begin to turn to like the haptic, the visual, the lyrical, and other types of influences from our surroundings, from our context, rather than simply depend on our cognitive behavior, which is something that has been absolutely and utterly trained in this kind of structural system that is not pluralistic in nature, and it is very much exclusionary. So I'm going to end with that, and here's to hoping to be more susceptible to outside influences, because as creative human authors, according to Bennett, we are ultimately beings that create relationships with other beings and other things, animate or inanimate, human and non-human, equally and simultaneously. Thank you.
Any questions?
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I was curious, I have two questions actually. The first one is, what elements of deconstructivism do you see that have influenced your own work? And my second question was, is if you think that architecture is violent, the act of building is violent inherently, no matter what, and if so, how us as architects can challenge that?
Very, very good questions. The first one is easier. I think, so the question of decon is influence. I don't know, because it's something that has happened probably from a conscious and unconscious plane. It's something that I think it was part of my education in my undergraduate studies, so it was something that was unavoidable in a way. And also, like, decon kind of like predecessed the digital process in so many ways. So I think in the period of time where I started to train as an architect, it was something that I had to be enmeshed in, right? So there's absolutely influences from decon into my work. But I think another, because I could easily say about like some of the other things that were in the air at the time, but I think one of the things that was really fascinating to me was Zaha's earlier works, and how she was incredibly wedded to the idea of weightlessness through concrete construction. So something that was completely bizarre, and it was something that she was interested in, the kind of physiological reaction of a person like walking into space. And I think out of a bunch of them, I think like she did it the best, in my opinion. So I think that probably started my interest in this kind of not putting things together and sort of like into like the decon, so to speak. But I want to say that further, I think I left that project there, and then for a while, and I think I would say that like parts of these are also like autobiographical in a way, because you can't ignore the sort of like the lineage and things that kind of like come into your life. They make up, and rightfully so, they make up your creative agency. And I think that that's something that should be embraced rather than tried to be controlled in a way. So in the question of like architecture, is it inherently violent or not? It depends. I think my interest at this moment is how to take violence that already exists elsewhere and how to respond to that, or how to be with it. Maybe not necessarily respond to it, but how to be with it through architectural means and architectural terms. A lot of times I find it kind of like an embellishment technique, a positivist technique to depend on architecture as a solution. And I think that's something that's kind of like rooted in Western ideology, that's sort of like been kind of like taught in schools, and it's a vetted system. So for me, I'm interested in taking this violence that we're all a part of, that in varying degrees and varying gradients, and expressing that through architectural form-making or architectural facade articulations, because sometimes we are relegated to just the surface of an architecture project, and that's a reality, and that's okay. Thank you for the question.
So I'm intrigued with this idea of lyrical force, kind of curiosity qualities, not embracing the kind of narrative from the start to the finish, but inserting yourself into the cinematic process. How close is that to some sense of the sublime, though? And is there a kind of tradition of experiential engagement with architecture that you can find some affinity with?
I have not thought about that. That is a really good question. That's a hard one. I'm not sure. I think.
Yeah, that's the second one.
Okay.
Which has to do with two things that came in at the very end of the talk. And Viola, the talk was wonderful.
Thank you.
It was really well done, really well presented, and you are just a wonderful lesson to our students about why they should read more.
It's true.
You really should. But it's scale and context. And until the very end, with Copy Red, and with your installation of Art Overlay, scale and context were evident. And then suddenly they were. And I was reminded of the story Michael Grace used to tell, that he was at a faculty meeting at Princeton, and he did this little abstract drawing, and he passed it around the table, and people kept adding little abstract components to it. And then someone dropped in a stair, and suddenly it all changed, right? Because it had scale there.
Yep.
And what was fascinating to me was to look at Copy Red, and suddenly there was the stair, right? And suddenly I could see myself in the scale again. And I think that's what's not yet clear to me in the work, and I think we've covered so much ground, it would take just more time to understand it better. And even the understory project, I think, there is a kind of scale to that, but that scale is dependent on context.
Yep.
Yet so much of your process, the context that isn't apparent and sort of came in only sort of at the end.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about that.
No, that's also a very, very fantastic observation. I think that maybe then, and again, I say it's an observation because it's something that I hadn't necessarily thought of in those terms, which is what makes these lectures like really beneficial for the talker. So the question of scale, I guess I'm not forefronting it, not in conscious terms. I think that I'm so enmeshed and embedded in this like digital kind of like melting of graphics onto forms, that whether a tread is the distance between two droopy lines or not is like kind of, it's the result, right? I think with Understory it was a little bit different, and it was really difficult. The scale in this project was something that like delayed us by like 3 months, because we kept changing it, and you can't just scale something in Rhino and expect the fabrication to just like, come at ease with it. But this one, it was interesting because again, like we were interested to present the project from something that existed on the ground with really low tables with the geological artifacts on the tables, because we're highlighting the southern Indiana geological samples. And then we also wanted to situate the pavilion on the underside of the tree canopies as well. So the pavilion kind of like negotiates between like the understory of the trees and the ground, and everything that else that happens in between is kind of like the resultant of that force of compression. But I would even argue that like the scale for this project is probably more powerful than the scale in Poppy Red, which is a problem, maybe, because even though this one doesn't have stairs and the one in Poppy Red does, because in this one, I think that scale becomes much more experiential, much more lyrical, whereas in Poppy Red, I think it just is, and it's not something that has actually been like thought about or worked through. So that experience, that vertical experience, it's not there. Very good question. I'm writing this down because I really want to return to that question of the sublime, because I don't even know I haven't thought about that.
Well, I'm giving away my own experience and probably even my own bias here.
As we should.
But I think you're burying the lead, and that's probably much too much a narrative comment. Criticism for you, but I think it's part of the story that can come in sooner.
Yeah, I mean it's true. Like I think a lot of times, and that's my critique of like the Bruno Latour and Thomas Sarasano, because a lot of the times like the thing that we're trying to not fix, but the thing that we're trying to sort of achieve or revoke or get to, a lot of times we reinforce older models by trying to get to that point, right? And which is totally okay. I think it's also like part of the process. But yeah, of course, there's going to be fissures and missed points in that construction of that project.
Wonderful to see that.
Thank you.
I guess I kind of go to what David said, but I did see like kind of like a meeting space or table in one of the kind of rooms you had. I kind of had a question about the tarp, or like what you put up top of like Poppy Red or the second house. Like when you kind of put the tarp over, does it kind of change the programs you put inside like the house itself, or does it alter like what goes where, or does the forms come first? Like I don't know what kind of you're thinking.
So multiple part question, a little bit. I love that you're using the term tarp. I've been using the term blanket, which is a little bit more cozy, and you're just going straight for the kind of like it's a tarp because it's like so haphazard and it's kind of like temporary. It's so I think like in that, and that's what I mean by the lyrical too. Like we use these terms and they just kind of have like lyrical effect, and they don't necessarily depend on the sort of like how you situate a tarp in the history of the tarp, whatever. In terms of the program, It's a little bit more secondary. My ambition with the program in these like 3D forms is that the program responds to the kind of formal conditions. So squeezing space on the interior, opening up space, how two spaces come together at an intersection point, and so on. So my ambition was that for that interior program to kind of seem like it was sort of like sprinkled throughout, and not necessarily kind of like planned in an organized way. But also the ambition is that can kind of like move around, and that program and fixtures and furniture doesn't necessarily define programmatic space, but rather we can see those things as something that activates that space, right? So if it's like a meeting table, or if it's a dining table or anything like that, to me it's not very important. What's important is what is the kind of like the haptic or the visual experience of being in that space, and how does that make you aware of where you are, or make you turn your head because you thought you saw something flicker, or whatever that what brings the extraordinary experience into that space. Which, if like some of you are working through like program and like One Studio or whatever, that would be like completely opposed to like how we teach program, myself included. But I think again, I think it's important to question these things, and I think it's important to kind of like step outside of that curricular. And I'm trying to tell this to myself as much as anyone else, to step outside of that so we can kind of explore these other ways of thinking through something as generic as like program or program planning.
I abstract this on this. I think like these kind of intersections between the kind of form and the kind of graphic are like these kind of lyrical moments. And I think those are just beautiful. I wonder how you kind of arise at the kind of two things to begin with. These two kind of, I guess the kind of question is like, where is your hand? How does your hand kind of, when do you decide when not to use your hand and when to use your hand?
I don't decide.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of, that's the idea of like the process that I'm trying to work with. It's a really great question. The 2D and the 3D, they're generated from the same kind of like, I'm going to call it like input geometry, which is just primitive geometries. And then I draw recursively on the primitive geometries, because starting with primitive geometries is just good as starting with anything in architecture, in my opinion. So the relationship is already there by some weird genealogy that is not actually present at first, but there is a kind of innate relationship between the two. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, please.
I think that my question is how there is a point where you decide that that's the kind of graphic that you're looking at.
Sort of. Kind of. Sometimes, because like none of these things are really like sort of final, and you'll see that there's actually deviations. Like if you look at like a plan view or an elevation view, the graphic might actually change. But I kind of know that. But like, and sometimes I don't even, I'm not going to say care, but like I wouldn't even keep track of that, because it seems to me like it's something that I don't necessarily have to sort of break down the design process or like the elements into like, version 3A B25 or whatever, right? But so that's where that's the whole point of like the lyrical, right? So because I'm the one that's doing the simulations and dropping and whatever, I'm the one that moves the slider in the animation sequence. I'm like, oh, frame 424, I like this one. But then like if I decided to exhibit 2 months later and I ran the animation 2 months later, I probably would not pick frame 424, I would pick something else. And to me that's a liberating moment of just like focusing on the process and letting the process be the project.
Is there a way that you can abstract even more though? I mean that's kind of the question that
to me, the question that I like to ask myself is like, is that evading responsibility?
Yeah.
Is that?
I guess where's that line though? Where's the evading? Where's the author and where's the evading completely?
So, but that's the thing. It's like the author is both me, the person who designed the software, the person who made the fabrication, who made the CNC. So it's not just like I'm the author. I'm just like one creative agent in this entire like enmeshed network. And I think that's also something that like as architects like we need to think about a little bit more. And like it's really complicated when you get into like practice, but it is like I think thinking about like enmeshing capacities and like networks, I think is a little bit more doesn't put the architect on a pedestal, so to speak. And yes, our school is really, really difficult, and it's very hard to be an architect. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy and time and resources. But at the same time, like I think like other disciplines have similar issues, and they have, we're all in it together. So it's not architects versus.
So as students, how can we try to relinquish the mindset of having a structure and a scale, and really trying to just focus on creating a form in a way where it feels more organic? Because in the end of the day, we do have to follow a construct of deadlines and things that have to be in the project. But I feel like what a lot of us have problems with is the decision fatigue and the creative fatigue of having to focus on all these elements at the same time. So it's kind of harder for us to kind of free up our mind when we know eventually we're going to have to put in stairs, eventually we're going to have to set a room with loftinesses and a certain scale of hallways and things as such. So how can we release our minds from that rigor of design?
Yeah, I mean that's a question that actually belongs, not belongs, but it extends to the curricular ambitions of every school, and every school does it differently, and every school has its own kind of problems to contend with, curricularly. I think that architecture as a discipline started from the kind of the Beaux-Arts model, which was a little bit more free thinking and creative with all its problems that it had anyway. And then over time, it became highly structured. It's a licensed profession and all these things and which in a way, you always have to struggle with this balance of the creative project and the kind of the architectural project. I would say that the thing that I would recommend as a starting point, because we're not going to fix it in a year, and I don't mean to use the term fix it, but we're not going to make long-lasting progress in a year. It's going to take a little bit longer than that. The thing that I would argue for, and this is what I do in my studios and in my seminars when I teach, is that we don't have to follow the tradition of, here's my partie, here's where my project fits in the grand history of the canon of architecture, and here's the 2,000 reasons why my project is this way. And I think as educators too, I'm hoping and I'm proposing that we're more open to students presenting a project with this felt right. And I think that will bring you and the project a lot closer, and it will open up other avenues for your collaborators to be more vulnerable together in the design process too. So that's something that I have to contend with, and I think some schools I think maybe are opening up to that idea, but it's going to take a really long time.
I think that's a great spot to end. Thank you so much, Viola.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.
I know, I don't know what's going on with that thing. Okay. I think you're
Very kind.
Hi. Nice to meet you. Thank you.